The air in the penthouse pediatric suite of St. Ambrose Private Medical Center was a monument to the failure of wealth. It was a space designed to deny the very existence of sickness, a sterile sanctuary of brushed steel, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the hushed, reverent silence that only obscene amounts of money could buy. Outside, the city glittered, a sprawling galaxy of light against the velvet black of the night sky, each pinprick a life, a story, a struggle that could not penetrate the triple-paned glass of this gilded cage. Inside, the only sounds were the soft, rhythmic sigh of a ventilator and the almost imperceptible hum of a dozen machines, their small green and red lights blinking like a private constellation around the bed. The room smelled not of illness but of expensive, ionically filtered air and the faint, cloying sweetness of imported lilies, a desperate attempt to mask the sterile undercurrent of antiseptic that clung to every surface. It was a place where power had met its match, where millions of dollars were thrown at a mystery that biology refused to solve, creating an atmosphere thick with the suffocating pressure of impotent rage. Elena Ramirez moved through this silent, opulent battlefield with the practiced invisibility of a ghost. Her movements were a study in quiet efficiency, the soft swish of her mop across the polished marble floors, a soothing, rhythmic counterpoint to the anxious beeping of the heart monitor. She was a figure in muted gray scrubs, her presence designed to be overlooked, her labor essential but unseen. Her hands, calloused and strong, held the mop handle with a familiarity that belied the mind working behind her dark, observant eyes. She saw more than just the dust and the faint smudges on the floor. She saw the subtle tremor in the nurse's hand as she checked the IV drip, the exhausted slump in the doctor's shoulders after another inconclusive consultation, and the discarded medical journals on the bedside table, their pages filled with highlighted passages on rare pediatric neurodegenerative disorders. She understood the language on those pages, the complex terminology of alkaloid toxicity and enzymatic inhibition, a language from another life, a life that had been stolen from her and buried under the crushing weight of necessity and familial duty. With every methodical sweep of the mop, a memory played on a loop in the quiet theater of her mind. It was the memory of her father, not as he was now, a statue of a man confined to a wheelchair, his once powerful farmer's hands lying limp in his lap, but as he used to be. She could almost smell the rich, dark soil on his clothes and see the sun-crinkled smile that used to light up his face. That man had been erased, his nervous system systematically dismantled by a poison that had seeped into the town's water supply, a gift from a distant, faceless corporation. The cold fury of that memory was a constant, low-burning fire in her gut. It was the fuel that got her through these long nights, the reason she endured the condescending glances and the casual dismissals. Every dollar she earned mopping these floors went to pay for her father's care, a mountain of bills that grew higher each month. This job, this cloak of invisibility, was her penance, her duty, and her silent, solitary war against the injustice that had shattered her world and derailed her promising career as a doctoral prodigy in the field of ethnobotany and toxicology. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. The quiet of the room was not broken, but shattered by the arrival of Julian Croft. He did not walk into the suite, he conquered it. The sound of his handmade Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble was sharp and aggressive, an assertion of dominance in a space that was supposed to be for healing. He was a man carved from arrogance, his tailored suit a piece of dark armor, the glint of a $50,000 watch on his wrist, a casual flash of power. His presence seemed to suck the very air from the room, replacing the fragile peace with a palpable tension. He carried a scent of expensive cologne and cigars, an olfactory assault that overpowered the delicate lilies and the clean scent of antiseptic. He barely glanced at his son, a small, pale form lost in the vastness of the high-tech bed, his gaze sweeping over the medical staff with the bored impatience of a king surveying servants who had failed him. He was already speaking into his phone, his voice a booming baritone that ricocheted off the glass walls, utterly devoid of any consideration for the sick child trying to rest. The conversation was a torrent of corporate jargon, a performance of power for the benefit of whoever was on the other end, and, more importantly, for everyone in the room. He spoke of leveraging assets, of hostile takeovers, of market dominance, his words painting a picture of a world where human beings were mere figures on a balance sheet. He gestured impatiently at a doctor, not to ask a question, but to issue a command for a glass of water, his tone leaving no room for refusal. To Julian Croft, this hospital room was not a place of vulnerability and fear. It was an extension of his boardroom, another domain where his will was absolute and every person within it, from the chief of pediatrics to the night shift janitor, was simply part of the staff, hired to serve his needs and whims. His eyes, cold and dismissive, finally scanned the room, his gaze snagging on a splash of vibrant color in the corner. It was a plant, lush and exotic, with delicate, bell-shaped flowers of a startlingly deep blue. He pivoted his phone call, his tone shifting from ruthless CEO to that of a proud collector. He was bragging now, the words dripping with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed every object he owned was a testament to his own superiority. He gestured towards the plant, a grand, sweeping motion designed to draw attention. He spoke of its rarity, of the fortune he had spent to have it imported, a special acquisition meant to purify the air in his son's room, as if nature itself could be bought and bent to his will. The very presence of the plant was a statement, another piece of extravagant decor meant to showcase his status, its living, breathing purpose, secondary to its value as a symbol of his wealth. Then came the moment that would alter the trajectory of all their lives. As he continued his boastful monologue to his business associate on the phone, his gaze fell upon Elena, who was quietly finishing her work near the far wall. He saw not a person, but a prop, a perfect, silent illustration for the point he was making. With a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, he made a dismissive gesture in her direction, a flick of the hand that wrote her off as insignificant, as part of the scenery. He leaned into his phone, his voice laced with theatrical contempt, ensuring everyone in the room could hear his casual cruelty. He wanted them to witness this small act of degradation, a reminder of the vast, unbridgeable gulf that separated his world from hers. He was reinforcing the natural order of things as he saw it, a universe where he was the sun and people like her were merely specks of dust floating in his light. The words he spoke were meant to be a final, crushing assertion of his own importance, a casual bit of theater using Elena as an unwilling extra. He mispronounced the plant's scientific name, a clumsy, arrogant attempt to sound knowledgeable, calling it a rare species that he had personally sourced. Then, with that dismissive wave still lingering in the air, he added the final, venomous touch, his voice dripping with condescension. He spoke of the complex science behind the plant's supposed air-purifying properties, a science, he sneered, that someone like her, a lowly cleaner, could never possibly comprehend. The insult hung in the sterile air, sharp and poisonous. He had used her, her uniform, her simple, honest work, as a punchline to underscore his own brilliance and status. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down for Elena. The rhythmic hum of the machines faded, and all she could hear was the echo of his disdainful voice and the loud, steady beating of her own heart. A white-hot fury, cold and solid, rose within her. It was a familiar feeling, the same rage that had been her constant companion since the day her father's world had shrunk to the four walls of his room. The dismissive gesture, the sneering tone, it was the same soulless arrogance that had poisoned her town, the same casual cruelty that had signed off on the reports that buried the truth, the same hubris that had ruined countless lives for the sake of profit. In that instant, Julian Croft ceased to be just an arrogant client. He became the embodiment of the injustice that had defined her life. The image of her father's face, etched with a pain she was powerless to heal, flashed behind her eyes. The insult was no longer about her, it was about him. It was about every family his corporation had dismantled. The invisible janitor, the woman who had spent years blending into the background, felt a profound shift within her. Her grip on the mop handle tightened, her knuckles turning white. Her breathing became slow, deliberate. The scientist she had been forced to bury was stirring, awakened by the very ignorance that sought to belittle her. Her eyes lifted from the floor, and for the first time she looked directly at the beautiful, deadly plant in the corner, and then at the pale, struggling boy in the bed. And in the silent, sterile air of that penthouse suite, she understood everything. The mop handle felt slick and cold in her suddenly still hands. The echo of Julian Croft's words, a casual barb thrown from an unassailable height, did not just sting. It detonated something deep within her, a dormant charge packed with years of suppressed grief and silent, burning indignation. For a fleeting second, the opulent penthouse suite dissolved around her, replaced by the faded floral wallpaper of her father's small room, the scent of antiseptic and lilies giving way to the faint, ever-present smell of medicinal soap and old books. She saw her father's hands, once strong enough to pull life from the stubborn earth, now resting inert and pale on the arm of his wheelchair. She felt the phantom weight of the thick legal binders she had studied night after night, their pages filled with chemical formulas and corporate denials that had become the scripture of her family's suffering. Croft's dismissive sneer was not just an insult to a janitor. It was the voice of every lawyer who had patronized her, every executive who had signed a memo that condemned a town to slow poisoning, every ounce of arrogant power that had crushed her world and left her to sweep up the pieces. A profound and terrifying calm washed over her, extinguishing the initial flare of hot anger and leaving in its place a core of pure, unadulterated certainty. It was the calm of a scientist who has just seen the final, undeniable piece of data click into place, the variable that solves the entire equation. Her breath, which should have been ragged with fury, became slow and even, each exhale a measured release of the passive victim she had been forced to become, each inhale a reclamation of the brilliant mind she had been forced to lock away. Her posture changed, an almost imperceptible shift that seemed to add inches to her height. She was no longer a hunched, invisible figure in gray scrubs. Her shoulders straightened, her spine aligned, and the weary deference in her expression was replaced by an unnerving focus. The janitor was gone. In her place stood Elena Ramirez, doctoral candidate, a specialist in the very language of poison that this man had so carelessly brought into his own son's sanctuary. She looked from the small, struggling child, whose labored breathing was a quiet metronome of suffering, to the beautiful, deadly plant in the corner, its blue petals a splash of serene lethality. She deliberately released her grip on the mop, her fingers uncurling one by one. She did not drop it or cast it aside, but leaned it gently against the wall with a quiet reverence, as if laying down a tool whose purpose had been served. The soft click of wood against plaster was a gunshot in the tense silence that had fallen after Croft's boastful phone call ended. Every eye in the room, the doctors, the nurses, Julian Croft himself, was now fixed upon her. They expected tears, perhaps, or a mumbled apology, a frightened retreat. They did not expect the quiet authority that radiated from her as she turned to face the billionaire. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, yet her eyes held a fire that could have melted the brushed steel fixtures on the walls. The air crackled with the unspoken question, the sheer improbability of this uniformed menial worker commanding the attention of a room filled with power and pedigree. She took a single, measured step forward, away from the shadows and into the sterile light of the suite, a silent declaration that she would no longer be part of the scenery. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that cut through the thick atmosphere of tension like a scalpel. It was a voice stripped of fear, of servitude, of the practiced meekness she had worn for years like a second uniform. It was the voice of a lecturer addressing a first-year student who had made a foolish, fundamental error. She began with a formal pleasantry that was so chillingly out of place it felt like a threat. "Sir, my apologies for the interruption." The words were polite, yet the tone was anything but. It was precise, analytical, and held the unmistakable weight of superior knowledge. She looked directly into Julian Croft's eyes, a violation of the unspoken caste system that governed his world, and held his gaze without flinching. For the first time, he was seeing her not as a function, a janitor, but as a person, and the sheer force of her unexpected presence seemed to momentarily short-circuit his brain, leaving him staring, his mouth slightly agape, a titan of industry rendered momentarily mute by the cleaning woman. "It is not a Madagascan moon petal," she stated, the name he had so proudly mangled falling from her lips with clinical disdain. "The correct classification is Aconitum caeruleum, a carefully cultivated hybrid, most likely originating from the Himalayan alpine regions." "It is beautiful, I agree, but it does not purify the air." Quite the opposite. The statement hung in the air, a direct contradiction, an act of intellectual rebellion that was more shocking than any shouted insult. She saw a flicker of confusion, then irritation, cross Croft's face. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances, their professional curiosity warring with their instinct to stay out of the blast radius of their wealthy client's temper. Elena did not pause to let his anger build. She pressed her advantage, her words flowing in a steady, academic stream, each fact a carefully placed stone building a bridge from the boy's mysterious symptoms to the plant in the corner. "Its common name is wolfsbane. A rather telling name, don't you think? The pollen," she continued, her voice unwavering, "contains a highly potent cardiotoxin and neurotoxin, specifically the alkaloid aconitine. In an enclosed, climate-controlled environment like this penthouse suite, with minimal air circulation, the microscopic pollen becomes a persistent aerosol. It is inhaled, absorbed through the mucous membranes. The initial symptoms would be subtle: numbness, tingling in the extremities, a general sense of lethargy and confusion. Sound familiar?" She gestured almost imperceptibly with her head towards the bed, towards the pale child hooked up to a symphony of machines. The chief of pediatrics, a man with 3 decades of experience, took an involuntary step forward, his eyes wide with a horrified dawning of comprehension. He was replaying weeks of inconclusive tests, of baffling results, of a medical mystery that had confounded his entire team, and suddenly, this woman in a janitor's uniform was providing the devastatingly simple, terrifyingly plausible answer they had all missed. As the aconitine accumulates in the system, she went on, her explanation becoming more technical, more damning, it begins to interfere with the voltage-gated sodium ion channels in the body's cells. This leads to cardiac arrhythmia, muscular weakness, and eventually respiratory paralysis. The very symptoms your son has been displaying with increasing severity for the past 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she repeated, letting the number land with the force of an accusation. "How long has this plant been in his room, Mr. Croft?" The question was a surgical strike, delivered with the calm precision of an interrogator. It was no longer a correction, it was an indictment. She was not just identifying a plant, she was identifying the source of a poisoning born of a father's arrogant, ignorant attempt to display his wealth. The $50,000 watch on Croft's wrist seemed to tick with agonizing slowness, each second marking the complete and utter demolition of his authority. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, filled only with the soft, rhythmic sigh of the ventilator that was breathing for Croft's son. The billionaire's face had cycled through a storm of emotions, from smug condescension to baffled irritation, then to sputtering disbelief, and finally, it settled on a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, pale canvas for the dark rage that contorted his features. He was a man who had never been contradicted, never been questioned, never been made to feel foolish, especially not by someone he considered less than human. The fact that she was right, a fact he could see dawning in the horrified eyes of the medical professionals around him, was not a relief. It was the ultimate humiliation. His ego, a vast and fragile construct, had been shattered, and all that was left was the raw, primal instinct to destroy the source of his shame. He found his voice, and when he did, it was not the controlled baritone of a CEO, but the raw, uncontrolled bellow of a wounded animal. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he roared, the sound so loud it seemed to shake the very glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Spittle flew from his lips. He took a menacing step towards Elena, his large frame radiating a palpable violence. She did not flinch. She did not take a step back. She simply stood her ground, her calm gaze an infuriating counterpoint to his explosive rage. "You are a cleaner, a mop pusher. You think you can walk in here and spout this pseudo-scientific garbage to me? To these doctors?" He gestured wildly at the medical staff, who now looked at him with a mixture of fear and newfound clinical concern, as if observing a patient in the throes of a psychotic break. His rage was so absolute, so blinding, that he couldn't see the truth that was now painfully obvious to everyone else in the room. He couldn't accept a reality where his money had not only failed to buy a cure, but had, in fact, purchased the very poison that was killing his child. His mind rejected the possibility, defaulting to its most basic programming: attack and annihilate any threat to its dominance. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling with adrenaline. He wasn't just going to fire her. He was going to erase her. He was going to make an example of her. He stabbed at the screen, bringing the phone to his ear and shouting into it before it could even ring. "Get me administration. Now! I want her out of here. I want her fired. Her insolence is unbelievable. She is practicing medicine without a license, endangering my son." The accusations were wild, desperate, the legalistic jargon, a pathetic attempt to regain control, to frame his humiliation as her crime. The response was swift and inevitable. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security guards appeared at the door, their expressions grim and uncomfortable. They had been given an order from the highest levels of the hospital administration, an order prompted by the furious demands of their most important benefactor. They approached Elena, their reluctance evident in their averted eyes. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the finality of a judgment. Elena simply nodded. There was no protest, no plea. As she was escorted towards the door, she allowed herself one last look at Julian Croft. He stood there, chest heaving, his face flushed with a temporary Pyrrhic victory. He had reasserted his power, banished the source of his shame. But as her eyes met his, she saw something else flicker beneath the rage, a sliver of raw, terrified doubt. He knew she was right, and that knowledge would be its own kind of poison, seeping into the foundations of his world long after she was gone. As she walked through the hushed, sterile corridors of the hospital, flanked by the 2 silent guards, a strange sense of detachment settled over her. The sympathetic glances from nurses, the curious stares from passing staff, none of it registered. It was as if she were watching a scene from a movie, a character being led away after a pivotal confrontation. The loss of her job, the only source of income for her father's crushing medical bills, should have filled her with a paralyzing panic. And for a moment, as the cold night air hit her face when the automatic doors slid open, and she was officially an outsider, a wave of cold dread washed through her. The reality of her situation was stark. She was unemployed, with no prospects, and a mountain of responsibility that had just become insurmountable. She stood on the curb, the city lights blurring through the sudden welling of tears in her eyes. The weight of it all, the years of sacrifice, the endless nights, the soul-crushing invisibility, it all came crashing down. But then, something Croft had shouted in his tirade echoed in her memory, a detail she had barely registered in the heat of the moment. He hadn't just screamed his name, he had screamed his title, a boastful assertion of his identity even in a moment of blind rage. "I am Julian Croft, CEO of Croft Global." The name. Croft Global. It wasn't just a name. It was a brand, a logo, a specter that had haunted her family for nearly a decade. The cold dread in her stomach instantly solidified into a block of ice. The tears evaporated. Her vision cleared, the blurred city lights snapping into sharp, glittering focus. It was him. It was the same company. The same faceless corporate entity from the court documents. The one that had manufactured the pesticide. The one that had deployed an army of lawyers to systematically dismantle the lives of the poisoned farmers in her hometown. The architect of her family's ruin was not some distant abstract villain. He was the man whose son she had just saved, the man who had just had her thrown out onto the street. A dizzying, vertiginous sense of fate washed over her. This was not a coincidence. The universe, in its cruel and mysterious way, had not been punishing her. It had been positioning her. Every moment of her life for the past 8 years, dropping out of her PhD program, learning to be a caregiver, taking this demeaning job, enduring the condescension, studying the boy's symptoms from the periphery, it had all been a prelude to this one night. The fight was no longer about a lost job or a wounded pride. It was about a justice that was years overdue. The humiliation she had suffered was nothing compared to the slow, grinding humiliation her father endured every single day. The anger she felt was no longer a personal emotion. It was the collective rage of an entire community that had been silenced and forgotten. She was not just Elena Ramirez, fired janitor, she was a witness. And she held a weapon far more powerful than any of Croft's billions, the truth. Her mind, the sharp, analytical instrument she had so long neglected, began to work with breathtaking speed and clarity. The objective was no longer just to survive, it was to dismantle. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed resources, credibility, a platform. She needed to trade her janitor's uniform for the armor of her former life. There was only one person who had never seen her as a victim, who had always lamented the loss of her brilliant mind to the world of science. Walking with a newfound purpose, she pulled out her old, cracked smartphone. Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up a number she hadn't dialed in years. It was a number that connected her to a past she thought was dead and buried, to a world of academia, research, and peer-reviewed truth. She pressed the call button, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against her ribs. The phone rang once, twice. A voice answered, thick with sleep and academic weariness. "Hello, Professor Finch? It's Elena Ramirez." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of confusion as the professor tried to place the name from a distant past. Then, recognition dawned. "Elena? My God, is everything all right?" His voice was filled with a genuine paternal concern that almost broke her composure. She took a deep breath, the cold night air steadying her nerves. "I'm fine, Professor, but I need your help. I have a story to tell you. It's about a man named Julian Croft, a company called Croft Global, and a poison that has found its way from the farmlands of my home to a penthouse suite in the St. Ambrose Medical Center." The words came out clear and strong, a declaration of intent, a promise of the storm that was about to break. She began to speak, her voice a low, urgent torrent of information. She recounted everything: the boy's symptoms, the plant, the arrogant dismissal, the firing. She laid out the toxicology with the precision of a research paper, her academic vocabulary returning as if it had never left. Professor Alistair Finch listened in stunned silence, the sleepiness in his voice replaced by a growing sense of horrified fascination. He was one of the world's leading experts in environmental toxicology, a man who had built his career on exposing the very kind of corporate malfeasance she was describing. He had been her mentor, the one who had seen in her the potential for greatness, and he had been heartbroken when she had been forced to abandon her studies. Now he was hearing that potential unleashed not in a lab, but in the real world, with stakes that were terrifyingly high. When she finally got to the part about Croft Global being the same company that had poisoned her hometown, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "My God, Elena," he whispered, the full, monstrous scope of the situation finally clear to him. This is more than just negligence. This is a pattern. This is a man who leaves a trail of poison wherever he goes." The validation in his voice was like water in a desert. He wasn't questioning her, he was corroborating her. He saw her not as a janitor with a wild story, but as a colleague, a fellow scientist who had uncovered something monstrous. He was no longer just a former mentor, he was her first ally. The weight on her shoulders didn't disappear, but for the first time in years, she felt she was no longer carrying it alone. "We have to prove it," he said, his mind already shifting into strategic mode. "Anecdotes aren't enough, not against a man like that. We need irrefutable scientific proof. We need to analyze that plant. We need to get a sample from the room. And we need to find the original documentation from the pesticide case, the internal reports they buried. Can you get me a sample?" The question was a test, a challenge. It was the first step in their counterattack. Elena looked back at the gleaming, impenetrable tower of the hospital, a fortress of wealth and power she had just been ejected from. A week ago, the task would have seemed impossible, but now her mind was already working, seeing pathways where before there were only walls. She thought of the night nurses who had shown her kindness, the other maintenance staff who moved through the building unseen, a network of invisible people who saw and heard everything. "I think so," she said, a new, steely resolve in her voice. "I think I can." The hunt had officially begun. The invisible woman was about to show Julian Croft just how much she had been taught to see from the shadows. The strategy sessions with Professor Finch were not held in a sterile boardroom, but in the cluttered, book-lined sanctuary of his university office late at night. The air smelled of old paper, brewing tea, and the faint, sharp scent of ozone from an aging computer monitor. It was a world away from the polished marble of St. Ambrose, a world where knowledge was the currency and truth was the objective. Elena felt a part of herself she thought was long dead reawakening in that room. The professor, a man with a gentle demeanor that concealed a fierce, bulldog-like tenacity for justice, mapped out their battlefield on a large whiteboard. He used a red marker to draw a stark diagram, with Julian Croft at the center, a spider in a web of corporate lawyers, shell companies, and public relations firms. On the other side, he drew a single circle and wrote her name in it. "We need to arm you, Elena," he had said, his voice low and serious. "Not with opinions, but with data. Cold, hard, irrefutable data that no lawyer can spin and no amount of money can bury." Their plan was a two-pronged assault, a campaign that needed to be executed with the precision of a military operation. The first front was the immediate crime, the poisoning of Croft's own son. This was their point of entry, the crack in the billionaire's armor. To prove it, they needed more than her word. They needed physical evidence, a direct, causal link between the plant and the boy. This meant obtaining a sample of the aconitum caruleum from the penthouse suite, a location to which she was now permanently barred. It also meant securing a biological sample from the boy himself, a blood or tissue sample that could be tested for the specific aconitine alkaloid. It was a task that seemed impossible, a heist that required bypassing a fortress of security and wealth. But as Professor Finch spoke, Elena's mind was not on the obstacles, but on the pathways. She was thinking of the people who, like her, were invisible to men like Croft, the network of service staff who knew the hospital's rhythms better than the doctors themselves. The second front of their war was the older, deeper wound, the systematic poisoning of her hometown and the destruction of her father's life. This was the true objective, the justice she had almost given up on ever achieving. Professor Finch explained that the original lawsuits had failed because Croft Global had successfully argued that the pesticide, while potent, was not the definitive cause of the neurological cluster. They had buried their own internal research, the damning reports that showed they knew of the dangers long before it ever went to market. Finding those documents would be like finding a single specific grain of sand on a vast beach. They were likely locked away in a secure digital archive, protected by layers of encryption and legal privilege. But Finch had a network of his own, a web of former students, fellow academics, and crusading journalists who had been fighting these battles for decades. He promised to start making calls, to shake the trees and see what fell out. The burden of proof was on them, and the mountain they had to climb was immense. Elena's first move was to reach out to her own network, a far cry from the professor's esteemed colleagues. Her key was a night nurse named Maria, a kind, overworked woman with whom Elena had often shared a quiet cup of coffee in the deserted cafeteria during their 3 a.m. breaks. Maria had been in the room during the confrontation. She had seen the truth in Elena's eyes and the ugly, panicked guilt in Croft's. Elena met her in a small, nondescript diner miles from the hospital, the air thick with the smell of frying bacon and old coffee. Maria was nervous, her hands trembling as she clutched her mug. She spoke of how the doctors had immediately and discreetly removed the plant after Elena was fired, and how the boy's condition had already begun to show subtle signs of improvement. "They're listening to you," she whispered, "but they're terrified of him. He could have this whole wing shut down with one phone call. They'll never admit you were right." Elena leaned forward, her voice calm and persuasive. She didn't speak of revenge or justice. She spoke of the child. She spoke of Maria's duty as a nurse, a duty that went beyond pleasing wealthy donors. "I'm not asking you to make a public statement," Elena said softly. "I just need a way in. A service entrance left unlocked for 5 minutes. A supply closet on the penthouse floor where I can wait for a shift change. That's all." She also explained the need for a biological sample, and saw the fear in Maria's eyes intensify. The nurse shook her head, whispering about the legal risks, the loss of her license, her entire career. Then Elena slid a small, folded photograph across the table. It was of her father, sitting in his wheelchair by a window, his gaze distant. "This is what Croft Global does," Elena said, her voice devoid of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. "They leave a trail of broken lives and count on good people being too scared to do anything about it. Your patient is just the latest victim." Maria looked at the photo, then at Elena's steady, determined face, and her fear was slowly eclipsed by a rising tide of righteous anger. The infiltration was a masterpiece of calculated risk, orchestrated using the intimate knowledge Elena had gained from years of mopping hallways and emptying trash bins. Maria provided the window, a 15-minute gap between the night security patrol's sweep of the penthouse floor and the arrival of the morning nursing staff. She left a fire stairwell door propped open with a small rubber wedge, a detail so minor it would be invisible to anyone not looking for it. Elena, dressed in dark clothing, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, slipped into the hospital's service underbelly. She moved through the labyrinthine corridors with the confidence of a ghost, the familiar smells of bleach and floor wax guiding her. Every sound was magnified, every shadow a potential threat. Her mind was a whirlwind of her father's face, Croft's sneer, and the quiet, trusting face of the nurse who was risking everything for her. This was no longer just her fight, it was Maria's too, and she could not let her down. She reached the penthouse floor, her breath held tight in her chest. The silence here was different, heavier, insulated by money. She found the janitorial closet Maria had described and slipped inside, the door clicking softly shut behind her. The small space was filled with the tools of her former life, mops, buckets, bottles of cleaning solution. For a moment the irony was crushing. She had to become the invisible janitor one last time to reclaim the scientist she truly was. Through the louvered door she watched the hallway. She saw the security guard pass, his keys jingling softly. Then, minutes later, she saw Maria, pushing a cart of medical supplies, pause by the suite door. The nurse fumbled with a vial, dropping it. As she bent to pick it up, she used her body to shield her hand as she deftly placed a small, plastic-wrapped garbage bag from the room's biohazard container just outside the door, behind a large, decorative urn. It was the trash from the previous day, which she knew would contain discarded swabs, used gloves, and other items from the boy's care. It was the perfect Trojan horse. After Maria had gone and the hallway was clear, Elena slipped out of the closet. Her movements were swift and silent. She retrieved the small bag, her gloved fingers closing around it. Inside, she knew, were the traces of DNA, the microscopic evidence she needed. The plant itself was gone, as Maria had warned, but Elena's target was not the plant, but its residue. She entered the now empty suite, a place of both trauma and opportunity. The air was cleaner, the oppressive floral scent replaced by the sharp tang of medical-grade disinfectant. The facilities team had done a thorough job, but Elena knew what they didn't. She knew that microscopic pollen was persistent, that it would have settled on every surface. She took out a set of sterile collection swabs from her pocket, a kit provided by Professor Finch. She methodically swabbed the windowsill where the plant had sat, the blades of the nearby air vent, and even the fabric of the armchair where Croft had made his arrogant phone call. Each swab was a silent accusation, each sample a nail for a coffin she was building. Back in Professor Finch's lab, the world shrank to the hum of machinery and the glow of computer screens. Here, Elena was not a janitor. She was a virtuoso in her element. She wore a white lab coat over her dark clothes, a symbol of her reclaimed identity. For 2 days, she and the professor worked with a singular, obsessive focus. They ran the samples through a gas chromatograph and a mass spectrometer, machines that could identify chemical compounds with absolute certainty. Elena's hands were steady, her focus absolute. She prepared the slides, calibrated the instruments, and interpreted the complex data streams with an ease that made Finch watch in renewed admiration. He saw the brilliant student he had lost years ago, now forged into something harder, more determined by the fires of injustice. There was no joy in the work, only a grim, methodical pursuit of the truth. The moment of discovery was not a shout of triumph, but a quiet, chilling confirmation. The screen displayed 2 graphs, 2 chemical fingerprints. One was from the pollen collected from the windowsill. The other was from a trace of blood found on a discarded cotton swab from the biohazard bag. The 2 graphs were identical. A perfect match. The sharp, unmistakable spike of aconitine was present in both. It was the smoking gun. The irrefutable, scientific link between the rare plant and the sick child. Elena stared at the screen, a wave of cold vindication washing over her. It wasn't relief she felt, but a profound sadness for the boy, a pawn in his own father's vanity. And beneath the sadness, her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She had proven the first crime. Now it was time to unearth the second, the one that had been buried for nearly a decade. While Elena had been focused on the scientific proof, Professor Finch had been activating his network. He had reached out to a man named Ben Carter, a grizzled, semi-retired investigative journalist who had a reputation for being a bloodhound when it came to corporate crime. Carter remembered the Croft Global case well. He called it the one that got away, the story that had been suffocated by an army of lawyers in a mountain of sealed documents. He had always suspected a cover-up, but had never found the inside source willing to talk. When Finch told him about Elena, about the new, provable instance of Croft's reckless negligence, Carter's journalistic instincts flared back to life. He agreed to meet them, his voice on the phone a low growl of interest. He saw a chance to finally finish the story that had haunted him for years. The meeting took place in the back booth of a dimly lit bar, the kind of place where secrets were currency. Ben Carter was a man whose face was a roadmap of late nights and lost battles, but whose eyes were still sharp and perceptive. He listened to Elena's story without interruption, his gaze never leaving hers. He wasn't just hearing her words, he was weighing her credibility, her resolve. He had seen countless victims, but he saw something different in Elena, a fighter, armed not just with anger, but with intellect. When she finished, he slid a thick, dog-eared file across the table. It was his old research on the pesticide case. "It's all circumstantial," he said, his voice raspy. "Town gets sick, company denies, courts side with the money. Standard playbook. The only way to win is to find someone from the inside who knew, someone with a conscience." Ben's renewed digging, fueled by the new information, created a ripple effect. He started publishing small, probing articles on his investigative blog, asking pointed questions about Croft Global's safety record, subtly referencing an anonymous source with knowledge of a recent incident at St. Ambrose. He was chumming the water, hoping to attract a shark. And it worked. A week later, he received an anonymous, encrypted email. The sender claimed to be a retired toxicologist from Croft Global's Research and Development Division, a man who had been forced into early retirement after raising internal concerns about the very pesticide that had destroyed Elena's town. He was riddled with guilt, and Carter's articles had been the final push his conscience needed. He was ready to talk. He had copies of the original unredacted safety reports, the ones Croft's legal team had sworn under oath did not exist. The rendezvous with the whistleblower Dr. Eris Thorne was arranged with the paranoia of a spy movie. It took place on a windswept pier at dawn, the gray light of the morning sky reflecting off the choppy water. Dr. Thorne was a frail, elderly man, his face etched with the heavy burden of a long-held secret. He clutched a worn leather briefcase to his chest as if it contained his own soul. He told them of the pressure from the top, the direct orders from Julian Croft himself to alter the data, to downplay the neurotoxic effects of the pesticide in the final reports. He spoke of a corporate culture where profits were valued above human life, a culture created and enforced by the man at the very top. Then, with trembling hands, he opened the briefcase and handed a slim USB drive to Elena. "It's all there," he said, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and relief. The original data, the altered reports, the internal memos with Croft's own signature on them. May God forgive me for waiting so long. Back in Finch's office, the three of them, the scientist, the professor, and the journalist, looked at the contents of the USB drive projected onto the whiteboard. It was more than they could have ever hoped for. It was a complete and utter indictment. It was the story of a cover-up, meticulously documented, from its inception to its execution. They now possessed two distinct and powerful weapons. The scientific proof of Croft's recent, personal negligence that nearly killed his son, and the documentary evidence of his past, far greater crime that had destroyed an entire community. Ben Carter's eyes gleamed with a predatory light. "A lawsuit is too slow," he said. "He'll bury you in appeals for a decade. A press conference is good, but he'll just call it a smear campaign from a disgruntled former employee. We need a stage from which he cannot run. A place where he is surrounded by his own people, the very people whose trust he has betrayed." The plan began to form, elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. The annual Croft Global shareholder meeting was in 2 weeks. It was the company's biggest event of the year, a carefully choreographed performance, where Julian Croft would stand before his investors and the international business press to celebrate a year of record profits. It was his coronation, his moment of supreme triumph, and it would be the stage for his execution. Ben Carter, using his press credentials, could secure a pass for Elena. She would not be a janitor or a victim. She would be an accredited member of the media, an anonymous face in a sea of reporters. She would wait for the open question and answer session, walk to the microphone, and in front of the entire world, she would burn his empire to the ground. Elena held the freshly printed press pass in her hand. The name on it was hers, but the woman it represented felt like someone new. She was no longer just a daughter fighting for her father. She was an agent of a justice that had been denied for too long. She looked at the two men who had become her unlikely allies, her war council. The professor, who had given her the tools and the confidence to fight, and the journalist, who was providing her with the stage and the microphone. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a powerful, clarifying sense of purpose. She thought of Julian Croft, standing on his stage, basking in the applause, completely unaware of the ghost from his past who was coming to collect a debt. The hunt was over. The evidence was secured. The plan was set. All that was left was the final, public checkmate. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Metropole was a cathedral built to the god of capital. Its ceiling soared 3 stories high, from which hung chandeliers that glittered like frozen supernovas, casting a cold, brilliant light over the thousands of attendees. The air was thick with the scent of money, a subtle and complex perfume of expensive leather, catered coffee, and the collective, unspoken confidence of the ruling class. On a massive stage, flanked by screens the size of city buses, Julian Croft stood at a sleek, minimalist lectern, basking in the warm glow of the spotlight and the thunderous applause of his shareholders. His face, magnified to monumental proportions on the screens, was a mask of practiced charisma and absolute control. He spoke of growth, of market penetration, of shareholder value, his voice a smooth, reassuring baritone that promised endless prosperity. To the world, he was a titan, a visionary, a king surveying his loyal subjects. He was utterly and completely invulnerable, a man at the peak of his power, entirely unaware that his executioner was already in the room. Elena Ramirez sat in the press section, a small island of anonymity in a sea of power suits. The press pass hanging from her neck felt heavier than a shield, a passport into the enemy's heartland. Beneath her simple, professional blazer, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that seemed loud enough to be heard over the applause. She watched Julian Croft on the stage, this man who was both a stranger and the architect of her entire life's pain, and she felt not a tremor of fear, but a vast, cold calm. The memory of her father was a steadying presence, a hand on her shoulder. She remembered his calloused fingers turning the pages of a book for her, the smell of the earth on his clothes, the easy smile that had been stolen from him. This was not for her. This was for him. This was for the names on a list that only she and a handful of forgotten people in a poisoned town still remembered. The moderator, on stage, announced the final part of the program, the question and answer session. This was her moment. The culmination of a decade of silent suffering was about to become a global roar. As the moderator called for the first question, Elena stood up. Her movement was deliberate, unhurried, yet it drew 100 glances. She was not the type of person who typically spoke at these events. She was not a seasoned financial reporter from a major network or a hedge fund analyst known for asking aggressive questions. She was just a woman, her face composed, her eyes holding an intensity that seemed utterly out of place in the sanitized corporate atmosphere. She began the long walk from her seat towards the microphone stand in the center of the aisle. Each step was a lifetime. The plush red carpet seemed to suck at the soles of her shoes, a final, soft attempt to hold her back. The spotlights felt like interrogation lamps, hot and blinding. She could feel the weight of thousands of eyes on her, a physical pressure. Her internal world was a storm of images, the sterile penthouse suite, the beautiful, deadly blue flowers, her father's vacant stare, the trembling hands of the whistleblower passing her the USB drive. All of it converged into a single point of absolute focus. She was no longer a victim. She was a weapon, forged in grief, sharpened by knowledge, and aimed directly at the heart of the man on the stage. She reached the microphone, her hand steady as she adjusted its height. The low hum of the ballroom's ventilation system was the only sound. The applause had died, replaced by a rustling, expectant silence. She looked past the blinding lights, directly at the figure on the stage. Julian Croft squinted back at her, a flicker of annoyance on his magnified face. He saw only an anonymous woman, a brief interruption before his final round of adulation. He did not recognize the janitor. He did not see the ghost of his past. He saw nothing. "My name is Elena Ramirez," she said, her voice clear and resonant, amplified by the powerful sound system to fill every corner of the vast hall. It carried no trace of the janitor's practiced meekness. It was the voice of a scientist, a witness, an accuser. "I have a question for Mr. Croft regarding Croft Global's risk assessment protocols and corporate due diligence, specifically concerning product toxicity." The question was a perfect professional opening, a Trojan horse built of corporate jargon. Croft's posture relaxed slightly, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. He was preparing a well-rehearsed, dismissive answer about their industry-leading safety standards. But Elena did not give him the chance to speak. She continued, her tone shifting from professional inquiry to a chillingly precise narrative. For example, when a product, say a rare decorative plant, is introduced into a sensitive environment, like a pediatric hospital suite, what steps does Croft Global take to ensure it is not, in fact, a potent source of aerosolized neurotoxins? A confused murmur rippled through the audience. On the stage, Julian Croft's smile froze, a grotesque rictus of confusion. The blood began to drain from his face as a sliver of recognition, a terrible memory of a woman in gray scrubs, began to pierce through the armor of his arrogance. Before he could process the attack, the massive screens behind him flickered, the Croft Global logo replaced by a new image, projected from Ben Carter's laptop in the back of the room. It was a crisp, scientific document, the mass spectrometry analysis from Professor Finch's lab. Two identical graphs were highlighted, showing a perfect chemical match. The caption below was stark and damning: aconitine alkaloid signature match, environmental sample, St. Ambrose penthouse suite, and patient biological sample. A direct, irrefutable link between his vanity project and his son's near-fatal illness. The murmur in the ballroom swelled into a wave of shocked gasps. Reporters were already furiously typing on their laptops, the scent of a major scandal filling the air. Croft stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from water. His carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture. Elena's voice cut through the rising chaos, sharp and relentless. "This failure of due diligence, this act of reckless negligence that nearly cost your own son his life, is not an isolated incident, Mr. Croft. It is a pattern of behavior." And then the second slide hit the screens, even more devastating than the first. It was a simple map of a rural county, with a small town circled in red, Oak Haven her home. A place that meant nothing to anyone in this room, but everything to her. Next to the map, a list of names began to scroll slowly upwards. The names of the farmers, the families, the children who had been struck down by the mysterious neurological plague. The final name to appear, stark and alone at the top of the list, was Antonio Ramirez. "My father," Elena said, her voice now thick with a grief that had been suppressed for a decade. "A victim of another of your products, the pesticide known as Solvix, which your company aggressively marketed despite knowing its devastating neurotoxic effects." The final blow landed with the force of an extinction-level event. The third slide appeared. It was a scanned document, an internal Croft Global memorandum dated 2 years before the pesticide was released. It was a report from Dr. Eris Thorne, a warning, detailing the exact neurological damage the chemical would cause. And at the bottom of the page, a handwritten directive in bold, arrogant ink: "Bury this report. Move to market immediately." Beneath the directive was a signature, now magnified 100 times for the entire world to see, an elegant, undeniable scrawl. Julian Croft. The silence that followed was absolute, a void of pure, collective shock. In that moment, Julian Croft was no longer a titan of industry. He was a man laid bare, his crimes exposed, his legacy incinerated in the space of 90 seconds by a woman he had deemed too insignificant to even look at. he stumbled back from the lectern, his face a canvas of utter disbelief and primal terror. The applause, the adoration, the power, it all evaporated, leaving him small, pathetic, and utterly alone on a stage that had become his pillory. The chaos erupted. A tidal wave of shouted questions, flashing cameras, and panicked board members rushing the stage, not to protect him, but to distance themselves from his toxic ruin. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. The empire that had taken decades to build crumbled in a matter of hours. The shareholder meeting ended in a chaotic rout. Julian Croft was escorted from the stage, not by a security detail, but by grim-faced board members who now saw him as a liability to be excised. The stock price of Croft Global went into a freefall, wiping out billions in value before the markets even closed. By the next morning, the story was on the front page of every major news outlet in the world. The leaked documents were irrefutable. Federal prosecutors, armed with the evidence Elena had delivered on a silver platter, immediately launched a sweeping criminal investigation into the company for fraud, criminal negligence, and a massive decade-long cover-up. The families from Oakhaven, once silenced and dismissed, now had their champion and their proof. Class action lawsuits were refiled, this time with the certainty of a victory that would not just compensate them, but would finally bring them the justice they had been so long denied. Julian Croft, stripped of his title, his fortune frozen, and his reputation obliterated, became a pariah, a modern-day monster whose downfall was as swift and total as his rise had been ruthless. 6 months later, Elena Ramirez stood by a different floor-to-ceiling window. This one was not in a hospital, but in her new corner office, on the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Manhattan. The plaque on her door read, Dr. Elena Ramirez, Director, Division of Environmental Toxicology and Corporate Ethics. A rival, ethically driven biotech firm, eager to position itself as the antithesis of Croft Global, had not just offered her a job, they had created a department for her. They had given her a platform, a budget, and a mandate to use her knowledge to hold corporations accountable, to be the watchdog that the world so desperately needed. She was no longer fighting a lonely battle from the shadows. She was now a commander, leading an army of scientists and investigators, funded and empowered to prevent future tragedies. The world of academia had lost her once, but now it had her back, not as a student, but as a leader, her brilliance no longer a secret weapon, but a beacon. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she saw the caller's name. It was the head physician from the Advanced Neurological Clinic in Switzerland, where her father was now a patient. His voice was filled with a cautious optimism she hadn't heard in years. The new experimental gene therapy, a treatment she could now afford without a second thought, was showing remarkable results. For the first time in nearly a decade, there were signs of nerve regeneration. It wasn't a cure, not yet, but it was something more precious. It was hope. She looked out at the sprawling city below, no longer an anonymous cleaner scrubbing its floors, but a guardian watching over it from above. Her journey had been forged in the crucible of suffering, but it had not broken her. It had transformed her. She had not sought revenge, but justice, and in finding it for her father and her town, she had found her own purpose, reclaiming not just her career but her power to change the world, ensuring that no one would ever be made to feel as invisible as she once had. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.